The ground was hard that morning, though not frozen. Thomas Gray's shovel struck the earth with the dull weight of finality, each motion pulling something from his chest as much as from the soil. He did not count how many times the blade sank into the dirt, only that the mound at his feet grew higher, darker, damp with the cold of dawn. Breath fogged the air before him, and every exhale seemed to vanish into the same silence that now filled his cabin, his barn, his world. The pine box was small, far too small for any man to lower into the ground without feeling he was burying a piece of himself. He had made it with his own hands the night before, planed the edges smooth though his vision blurred, sanded the corners though his palms ached. Would that should have been used to mend a fence or patch the door had been turned to this. He lowered it into the hollow beneath the cottonwood, the tree that had shaded his wife's grave 3 years earlier. A rough wooden cross, carved from a broken fence rail, was pressed into the earth above it, leaning slightly, as though even it bore the weight of grief. Thomas knelt, resting one broad hand on the soil. His other hand brushed dirt from the knees of his trousers, as if the gesture could restore dignity to an act that had none. He did not pray. Prayer had long since left his lips, abandoned in the long nights of watching fevers rise and breathing stop. He stared instead at the cottonwood branches, bare now in winter, creaking softly as the wind threaded through them. He wondered if the sound would be the same in spring, when buds returned. He wondered if he would live to hear them. When the last of the dirt was pressed flat, Thomas wiped the handle of his shovel clean and leaned it against the trunk. His palms were raw where splinters had dug in. For a moment he stood motionless, hollow-eyed, his frame drawn tall against the paling horizon. The sun broke weakly across the plains, washing the earth in a dull gold that did nothing to warm him. The grave looked both too shallow and too deep, shallow in what it held, deep in what it took. He walked back across the field toward his cabin, boots leaving dark imprints in the frosted ground. The corral was empty, the barn still. Even the animals seemed to know silence was the only fitting sound. He poured water into a tin cup inside the cabin, sat at the rough-hewn table, and drank without taste. The rocking chair in the corner stood vacant, its gentle creak echoing in his memory. He looked at it until the emptiness grew unbearable, then turned his eyes away. The day passed without notice. He moved through it like a shadow, mending a harness, stacking firewood, though his mind was elsewhere, circling the grave. The hours slipped past until the light shifted, leaning toward evening. By habit more than intent, he saddled his horse and rode the pasture line, scanning the horizon though there was little left to guard. The land stretched in every direction, quiet but not empty, the kind of quiet that reminded him he was alone in it. It was near dusk when he saw her. At the edge of his fence line stood a young woman, still as the cottonwood that marked his grief. Her skin bore the bronze warmth of the southern tribes, her braid thick and long, falling over one shoulder like a rope of black river water. She could not have been more than 20. In her arms she cradled a newborn, wrapped in a shawl the color of faded sky. The baby's cries broke the stillness, thin and sharp, cutting through the dry air like a hawk's call. Thomas reined in his horse, staring at her across the short distance. She did not step forward, nor did she retreat. Her gaze held his steadily, though he could see the exhaustion in the slump of her shoulders, the tremor in the hand that supported the infant's head. She did not beg. She only stood, the child against her breast, her eyes asking what her lips refused to. The wind tugged at her braid, pulling strands loose to whip across her face. She shifted slightly, pressing the shawl closer around the baby, who quieted under the pressure of her body's warmth. Thomas felt something tighten in his chest, something sharp and unwelcome. He had buried one child at dawn, now, by dusk, another had been placed before him as if the earth itself mocked his grief. He did not speak. Words seemed foreign, heavy. Suspicion flickered in him, of her, of what she brought, of the trouble her presence would invite. Yet desperation, raw and undeniable, radiated from her stance. It was in the way she swayed gently, instinctively, to soothe the child. It was in the redness of her eyes, the set of her jaw as though she would stand there until her strength failed entirely. Minutes passed. The prairie stretched endless around them, sky darkening, shadows lengthening. A coyote called in the distance. The horse shifted beneath Thomas, impatient, but he did not move. His grief collided with hers in that silence, two lives broken in different ways yet pressed now into the same narrow space of choice. He could have told her to leave. He could have pointed her back toward the horizon, sent her wandering into the night where the cold would finish what despair had begun. Yet he did not. Nor did he invite her in. Thomas dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the softening dirt. He opened the gate with one hand, leading his horse through, and glanced back only once. She was still there, shawl tight around the child, watching him as though waiting for judgment. He did not speak. He did not gesture. But when he left the gate unlatched behind him, it was invitation enough. She stepped forward at last, her feet dragging in the dust, the baby shifting against her chest. She crossed into his land without a word, without thanks. And Thomas, hollow-eyed and heavy with the day's sorrow, turned his face toward the cabin, knowing the silence that awaited inside would not be his alone anymore. The morning after her arrival was gray with thin light, the kind that seemed to seep rather than shine. Thomas rose before the sun as he always did, though his body ached from a night of restless sleep. The faint sound of stirring reached him from the hearth. She had risen too, the child pressed to her breast, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. The fire had been coaxed into a steady flame, and a pot of water simmered quietly above it. She did not look at him as he crossed the cabin. Nor did he speak. Silence hung between them like a wall neither had yet decided to climb. Only when the child made a soft, impatient noise did she glance up, her dark eyes catching the morning light. Later, he learned her name. She spoke it quietly, her accent shaping each syllable into something almost musical. Ahyoka. He repeated it once under his breath, not to her but to himself, as though testing how it sounded in the cabin's emptiness. It lingered there, unfamiliar yet steady, like the faint smell of cedar smoke that clung to her clothing. Over time, he drew the rest of her story in fragments, scattered like dry leaves carried on the wind. She had walked for days across the desert, abandoned by those who should have claimed her. Her tribe had marked her with shame, casting her out for bearing a child fathered by a settler. The man had left her, and her kin had judged her, so she was left to wander between two worlds that would not have her. She spoke without bitterness, but the hollowness in her voice was sharper than anger. Thomas listened in silence. He knew the shape of rejection, though his had worn different faces. He had been widowed young, the life he had built with his wife crumbling into dust. His only brother had turned from him after bitter words at the graveside. The neighbors, superstitious and cruel, whispered of curses when misfortune struck his ranch, pulling further from him until their distance was complete. His own land had grown barren of laughter, of voices, of belonging. He looked at her across the cabin and felt, for the first time in years, the faintest stirring of recognition, not of kinship, but of likeness. Both of them were ghosts among the living, carrying wounds too deep to speak of and yet too present to deny. The days grew into rhythm. She did not ask to stay, nor did he tell her to go. Instead, she moved with quiet purpose, tending to her child and lending her hands where they were needed. Her braid, long and thick, often whipped against her shoulder as she worked, as though it tethered her to something unbroken, some shred of dignity that exile could not strip away. One afternoon, Thomas found her at the corral, balancing the infant on one hip while mending a break in the rail. The wind caught at her braid, sending it streaming behind her like a banner. Her hands, quick and sure, tied knots with the same skill she used to hold her baby steady. He stood for a long moment, watching, though he did not mean to. The sight of another figure on his land, working as though it were her own, struck something inside him, something too long starved of company to name. That evening, as shadows stretched long across the plains, Thomas sat at the table mending a torn sleeve. His stitches were clumsy, uneven. Ahyoka, settling the baby into the rocking chair, glanced at his work. Without a word, she crossed the cabin, slid the needle gently from his fingers, and began again. Her movements were neat, practiced, the thread pulling smoothly through the fabric. The baby's small hands waved in the air beside her, the chair creaking gently with its rhythm. Thomas watched, saying nothing. The sound of thread slipping through cloth was steady, like the beat of a heart. For the first time since he had lowered the pine box into the ground, the cabin did not feel like a tomb. The walls seemed less oppressive, the silence less suffocating. The rocking chair creaked with life once more, not memory. When she handed the shirt back to him, the stitches were straight, even, almost invisible. He muttered his thanks, his voice low from disuse. She only inclined her head slightly, as though the gesture were enough. That night, when he lay on his bed staring at the beams above, Thomas found that the emptiness pressing on his chest had shifted. It was still there, but softer at the edges. Her presence had not lifted his grief, nor could it, but it had thinned its shadow. For the first time, he wondered if the cabin might hold something more than sorrow again. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, carrying with it the smell of dust and far-off rain. Ahyoka's braid brushed against the baby's blanket as she leaned over the cradle she had fashioned from an old crate. Her lullaby, sung in words he did not understand, drifted through the cabin, mingling with the creak of the rocking chair. Thomas closed his eyes, listening, and felt the faint warmth of shared labor begin to thaw the cold that had long settled over his life. The storm came without warning, rolling across the horizon like a black curtain being drawn over the sky. By late afternoon, the prairie air had grown heavy, charged with a stillness that prickled against the skin. Thomas knew the signs well enough, the silence before the breaking. He had been mending the hinge of the barn door when the first gust came, rattling the boards with sudden violence. He looked up to see Ahyoka outside the corral, the baby tied against her chest with the faded blue shawl, her braid whipping in the wind. Then the heavens split. Rain fell in sheets, slashing sideways, driven by a wind that bent the grasses flat and tore dust from the earth. Thunder rolled low, steady, like the growl of something vast moving unseen across the plains. Ahyoka hunched against it, arms curled around the child, stumbling as she tried to shield the infant from the downpour. Thomas dropped the hinge, striding toward her without a word. The rain soaked him through in seconds, plastering his shirt to his back. He reached her quickly, one large hand steadying her shoulder. Their eyes met briefly, hers wide with alarm, his steady, unreadable. He did not speak, he only guided her toward the cabin, shielding her with his frame as best he could against the driving rain. Inside, the storm beat down upon the roof, rattling the shutters, seeping through every crack. The sound was deafening, the kind of roar that swallowed all other noises. Thomas lit a lantern and set it on the table, its glow pushing back the darkness in small defiance. Ahyoka clutched the baby close, its thin cries rising against the hammering of the rain. The fire on the hearth was nearly out, but Thomas crouched, coaxing it with kindling until flames licked up again, casting gold across the cabin walls. He nodded toward the rocking chair, old and worn, the same chair his wife once held their child in. Thomas busied himself with the blackened kettle, pouring water and coffee grounds into it. The smell rose strong and bitter, carrying with it a kind of grounding comfort. He set a tin cup on the table, the steam curling upward, then pushed it gently toward her. "Coffee," he said. It was the first word he had spoken to her since she arrived. His voice was low, rough with disuse, but steady. She looked at the cup, then at him. Slowly, she nodded. "Thank you," she said, her English halting but clear. Her fingers, long and nimble, wrapped around the tin. She sipped, wincing at the bitterness, yet she drank as though it steadied her. The baby whimpered again, and she hushed it with a soft murmur in her own tongue, rocking gently, her braid sliding over one shoulder like a rope anchoring her to the chair. The storm raged on, thunder cracking so close it shook the cabin. Thomas poured himself a cup and sat across from her at the table, watching the firelight flicker across her face. It was then, between the storm's growls, that fragments of her story spilled into the space between them. The father of her child had been a settler, a man who promised her shelter, who spoke soft words beneath the cottonwoods in summer. She had believed him, though her people warned her. When her belly grew heavy, his words turned to silence. By the time the child stirred within her ribs, he was gone. Her tribe had seen her return with shame written across her body. They called her cursed, said the blood of two worlds could not thrive. Her mother turned her face away. Her brothers spat in the dust. So they cast her out, giving her nothing but the shawl she wore and the child she carried. She spoke haltingly, in broken English and fragments of her own tongue, but Thomas understood enough. Betrayal was clear in the silence of her voice when the words failed her. Thomas sat still, his cup cooling in his hands, listening as the fire popped and the storm battered the cabin. He thought of the small grave under the cottonwood, of the child he had buried, of the wife he had lowered into the ground before that. His grief did not mirror hers exactly, but it leaned close enough to touch. The baby's cries softened, lulled by the rhythm of the rocking chair. Ahyoka's voice fell quiet, her eyes lowered, the story tapering into silence. Thomas shifted slightly, setting his cup down, and for a long moment they simply sat, listening to the storm rage outside and the fire burn low within. The room smelled of smoke and coffee, of wet wool drying by the hearth. The rifle's shadow stretched long across the floor, but it no longer seemed ominous. Instead, it seemed like a guard standing sentinel, a reminder that for this night at least, no harm would cross the threshold. Thomas leaned back, his gaze on the flames. He said nothing, he had no words of comfort to give, no wisdom that could mend what was broken. Yet he realized, in the stillness between thunder and firelight, that survival was not only measured by cattle and soil, by how many fences one could mend. It was measured too by the warmth of another's presence when the storm came, by whether one could keep another soul from breaking in the night. For the first time in many seasons, Thomas did not feel entirely alone inside the cabin's four walls. The days after the storm settled into a hush that was not peace. It was the hush of a man walking a fence line he could not afford to mend, and of a woman who knew that one wrong whisper could burn a roof. Thomas rose before dawn and worked past dark, not because there was more to do than usual, but because the rhythm kept his thoughts from breaking through. Ahyoka kept to the cabin and yard, washing cloths, boiling water, and quieting the child with the soft sway of her body. The rocking chair found a steady creak, like an old song returning to itself. The land around them held memory like a bruise. Neighbors had long said his ranch was marked. Calves took sick, fences failed, storms seemed to sit on his roof while the sky stayed clear in town. Men liked to say that luck ran in a family the way blood did, and Thomas's blood had lost too much. Even with no one on the road, he felt the weight of eyes. At night he heard again the scrape of his shovel against the cottonwood's roots. He told himself he had taken Ahyoka in because a man did not leave a mother and child to the weather. Duty was solid. Duty could be named. Yet when the day cooled and she tied her braid with a strip of leather, when she crossed the yard with the child high against her chest and the late light caught the curve of her cheek, something rose in his throat like dust. He swallowed it the way he swallowed the bitterness of black coffee. He went to town for salt and nails. The bell of the general store rang, and the talk at the stove went quiet in a way that made his skin prickle. He kept his hat low, said little, and left quickly. A wind met him on the street though the day was still. Rumor could make weather of its own. That evening he oiled the rifle at the table. Metal and coffee and cedar smoke braided into one smell. Ahyoka sat near the hearth, the child asleep in the rocking chair, small chest rising as evenly as coals breathe. She watched him without asking questions, and for that he was grateful. Words had become traps in his mouth. The knock came deep in the night. Lantern light pooled under the door and traced itself through the cracks, turning the room into a thin map of gold lines. Thomas stood, set the rifle back on its pegs, and lifted the latch. 3 men waited in the yard, horses blowing steam in the cold. Their hats were pulled low against a wind that did not blow, their faces pale in the lantern glow. The tallest held the light high so it struck Thomas's eyes. The other 2 let their hands rest near their belts with an easy weight that was not ease at all. Evening, Gray, the tall one said. He spoke the name as if he had carried it too long. We heard you took in company. Thomas kept his silence. We are not here for a quarrel, another added, voice smooth but tight. We just need to know what sort. Folks have seen a woman near your place. Not our kind. And a child. The lantern hissed. Behind Thomas, the fire gave a small pop, like a seed opening. He felt the air shift at his back as Ahyoka rose, then still again as she stopped near the chair. He did not turn. I will ask plain, the tall one said. Is she inside your house, and is the child hers? There is a woman and a child under my roof, Thomas said. What sort of woman? The second pressed, though his mouth already held the shape of insult. The sort who needed shelter. The third man released a short laugh. There is shelter in town, if the church sees fit. But that kind does not always belong beneath a Christian roof. Thomas let the silence answer. Tonight it was not retreat. It was refusal. He allowed it to draw out until the horses shifted and the men looked at one another. We will look in on you, the tall one said at last. Neighbors keep account of neighbors. That is all. He tipped the lantern toward the cracks, as if to remind Thomas how thin his walls were, then turned his horse. The others followed. Their lights moved away like slow stars that had forgotten their part of the sky. When the dark closed in again, Thomas lowered the latch and let his hand rest on the wood. Behind him the baby stirred and settled. He turned at last. Ahyoka stood near the rocking chair with her shawl tied at her throat, her face calm in a way that looked learned rather than natural. I can go, she said. The words were careful, each one placed where it would do the least harm. I will not bring trouble to your house. He shook his head. No sound came. His throat refused it. He stepped to the peg by the door and lifted a parcel wrapped in brown paper, a shape he had not touched since the year his wife went into the ground. He unfolded it and held it out. It was his late wife's shawl, cream wool with a border of faded rose thread. He had not known why he kept it until this moment. He did not know how to speak what it meant. He offered it with both hands. Ahyoka did not take it at once. She looked at him, at the shawl, at the chair where the child slept. Then she accepted the wool gently, as if it could still break. She draped it over her shoulders and closed it high at the throat. The old fabric made her seem both younger and older. It suited her in a way that surprised him. Thank you, she said. Her voice was not small, not loud. It filled the room the way lamplight did. He nodded and set the kettle on the trivet. The old tools of living had always been there, pot, cup, blade, broom. Tonight they felt like promises he could keep. He sat with his hands flat on the table, listening to water gather its small voice. Outside, a coyote called and another answered, thin notes threading the dark. The cabin held the sound and returned it softer. The rifle on the wall threw its familiar shadow across the floor. The cradle crate by the hearth looked sturdy. The rocking chair found a slow rhythm and kept it. Thomas watched the rise and fall of the child's breathing. For years he had believed loneliness had been laid upon him like a sentence. In the quiet he understood something he had not named. Loneliness had become a shelter he had chosen, because it asked nothing of him and risked nothing in return. To keep Ahyoka and her child, he would have to step out from under that roof and stand where the sky could see him. He lifted his eyes to hers. You stay, he said at last. She inclined her head. The answer placed itself between them like a stone that would not be moved. The house did not grow larger, yet the room felt wider. The hush inside was no longer the hush before a storm. It was the hush after a decision, when a life turned and began to face another way. The night was quiet in the way only wide country could be. Coyotes had not yet begun their song, and the air lay still as if holding its breath. Thomas sat at the table, oiling the rifle he had not carried in months, the lamplight drawing a sheen across the barrel. Ahyoka moved by the hearth, rocking the child with a slow sway, the shawl pulled close around her shoulders. The hush was steady, the kind that could fool a man into thinking life had finally settled. Then the smell came, sharp and wrong. Smoke. Thomas's head snapped up. In an instant he was on his feet, knocking the chair back, pushing open the door. The night was lit by an orange glow, the barn roof already alight, flames clawing into the sky as though trying to rip it open. Shadows of men moved against the fire, their laughter carried faint on the wind. Raiders, or perhaps only neighbors, emboldened by hate. To Thomas it made no difference. "Stay inside," he said, voice low but edged with steel. He seized a bucket from the stoop and ran toward the barn. The fire roared as he neared, heat blistering his skin, sparks bursting into the dark like swarms of fireflies gone mad. The horses screamed within, kicking against their stalls. Thomas fought the latch, smoke stinging his eyes, and drove them out into the yard, slapping their flanks to send them clear. He turned back for the cows, but the roof groaned above, timbers cracking. A shout rose behind him, laughter again, cruel and triumphant. Then something struck him. A rock, or the butt of a gun. Pain seared through his temple, and the world tilted. He staggered, fell to one knee, the bucket spilling useless water into the dirt. Blood slicked warm down the side of his face. From the cabin came a cry, not the child's, but Ahyoka's voice, sharp with command in a tongue Thomas could not name. Through the haze of smoke he saw her, the baby strapped to her chest, dragging his arm with a strength born of desperation. She hauled him back toward the cabin, away from the collapsing barn, her breath ragged but steady. Inside, she pushed him against the wall, the infant still pressed close. Her eyes darted to the mantel, where the rifle hung. With one swift motion she seized it, bracing the stock against her shoulder the way she must have seen Thomas do. The door burst open, and lantern light cut across the floor. Shadows of men shifted just beyond. Ahyoka stepped forward, shawl trailing, rifle steady in her hands. She fired. The sound cracked the night apart, louder than thunder, louder than the barn's collapse. The shot went wide, deliberate, a warning. The echoes rolled across the plains, bouncing from horizon to horizon until it seemed the very land had shouted. The figures outside cursed, stumbled, fled into the dark. Hooves beat the ground, then faded, leaving only the fire's crackle and the newborn's muffled whimper. Smoke thickened the air, crawling under the door and seeping through the shutters. Ahyoka lowered the rifle slowly, hands trembling now that the danger had passed. She set it back upon the mantel as though returning a relic to its place, then turned to Thomas. His blood had darkened one side of his face, and ash clung to his shirt. He tried to rise, but she pressed a firm hand against his chest. "Sit," she said. The word was halting, but the tone brooked no argument. He obeyed. She moved quickly, fetching a cloth and wetting it at the basin. With gentle precision she cleaned the cut at his temple, her fingers light but sure. The fire outside roared itself lower, timbers collapsing into glowing ruin, the barn reduced to a skeleton of embers. When the danger had passed, when the last flames had weakened into red veins across black beams, Thomas stepped outside with her. They sat together on the stoop, the night cool against skin still heated by smoke. The stars stretched endless above, cold and clear, as if untouched by the violence beneath. Ash clung to their clothes, streaked across their faces, caught in Ahyoka's braid. The child slept against her chest, rising and falling with the rhythm of her breath. She rocked gently, though the chair was far behind them now, her body providing the motion. Thomas watched her, then let his gaze fall to his hands. Scars lined them, old and new, the map of a man's labor and loss. She shifted closer. Without speaking, she laid her free hand atop his. Her palm was small, calloused in places, but warm. For a long time neither of them moved. The contact was not possession, nor plea. It was acknowledgment, of what had passed between them, of what they had endured together. Thomas turned his hand slightly, curling his fingers over hers. His breath steadied, the weight in his chest loosening. He had thought grief made him stone, that exile had hollowed him into something less than a man. Yet here, ash on their clothes and fire still smoldering in the night, he felt something stir. Not joy, that was too far, but life returning, slow and quiet, like green shoots breaking through charred earth. They did not speak. Words would have broken the spell, reduced it to something smaller. Instead they sat beneath the vast spread of stars, the ruins of the barn behind them, the future still uncertain. The fire had taken much, but it had given something back as well, a bond forged not in promise but in survival, in defiance of those who would see them scattered. When the child stirred, Ahyoka shifted him in her arms, humming a low tune Thomas did not know. The melody twined with the hiss of dying embers, with the night wind moving through the grass, with the steady beat of Thomas's heart against his ribs. For the first time, he did not see her as a stranger under his roof. He saw her as the woman who had lifted him from the dirt, who had fired his rifle into the night when his strength failed, who had chosen to stand in the same circle of light when all others turned away. And in that quiet, with her hand still resting in his, Thomas Gray understood, he no longer sheltered her. She sheltered him too. Dawn broke pale over the prairie, its light thin and cool, touching the black ribs of the barn that still smoldered in ruin. The air smelled of ash and wet earth. Thomas Gray stood in the yard with a strip of fence rail shaved into a cross, its edges raw beneath his hands. Behind him, the cottonwood shifted in the faint wind above the small mound where his child rested. Ahyoka stepped from the cabin, the baby bound to her chest in the faded blue shawl. Over her shoulders lay the cream wool shawl that had once belonged to Thomas's wife. The border of rose thread framed her throat, worn but dignified. The horse stamped against the cold, breath rising in steam. The rifle hung ready in its sling. Thomas set the new cross against the saddle. "We go to town," he said. His voice was steady, stripped of hesitation. She nodded once. With care, she mounted behind him, the baby pressed safely between their bodies. He gathered the reins, feeling the warmth of the infant soak through cloth into his back, a heat both fragile and anchoring. They rode out beneath the whitening sky. Frost lifted from the grass like breath given back to the world. Jackrabbits scattered into brush as the horses' hooves struck the frozen ground. In the distance, smoke rose from chimneys in town, a thin seam stitched along the horizon. The sun edged higher, casting a brittle brightness over the land. The town woke slow. Shopkeepers propped open doors, brooms scraped thresholds, and the clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoed faint across the street. When Thomas and Ahyoka entered, heads turned. Whispers ran swift, rippling ahead of them like wind in dry wheat. Thomas kept his gaze fixed on the churchyard at the far end of the street. He did not bow his head. The child cried once, sharp and clear. The sound carried, cutting through the murmurs. Ahyoka's chin lifted, her braid brushing across his back as she steadied the infant. They passed the general store. The men at the stove fell silent in the doorway. The preacher's wife froze on the boardwalk, hand raised halfway to her mouth. A pair of boys stared openly, unashamed in their curiosity. One of the lantern men from the night of the visit stepped into the street, matching their pace a short distance away. His hat brim shadowed his eyes, but his jaw was tight as if clenched against words unsaid. At the churchyard gate, Thomas dismounted. He tied the reins to the fence and reached up to help Ahyoka down. She stepped lightly, the baby close against her chest, and followed him into the frost-stiff grass. The cottonwood spread bare limbs above two mounds. One old, one new. Thomas carried the cross to the fresher grave, where the soil still looked unsettled. He pressed it into the ground, not as a marker of death but as a vow. His palm rested against the wood, then dropped to the earth. Boot steps gathered at the fence. Men from town stood in a line, faces guarded, mouths pressed flat. The preacher came last, a book against his chest. He looked from Thomas to Ahyoka, then to the child. Brother Gray, he said. This is not the path we would have chosen for you. Thomas rose and faced him. He did not answer. The silence was firm, like a stake driven into good ground. The tall man from the lantern night stepped forward. No quarrel here, he said, though his stance was stiff. But ways are ways. That woman is not yours. That child is not yours. Trouble follows when a man takes in what isn't his. Ahyoka stood unflinching, the baby against her, eyes steady. Thomas felt the old life, the one that bent beneath the weight of others' judgment, press on him. He let it pass. His hand steadied on the saddle horn, rooted. From the fence, a woman's voice called, softer. But the child will need feeding. That is truth. Thomas touched the cross again. His voice was plain, low but clear. No one under my roof will be turned out. The words carried. They needed no force. They were weight enough. The preacher studied the ground, then the sky, as though seeking scripture between both. At last, he said, a vow binds. If you speak it, keep it. The tall man's mouth twisted. Sin is still sin. Before Thomas could answer, the infant cried again, high and sharp, like a blade cutting cloth. The sound startled starlings from the church eaves. They wheeled into the sky, scattering in dark ribbons against the pale morning. Thomas looked at the child, at the small fists pressing against the shawl, and something shifted in him. It was as if a rope had been thrown to a man who had nearly ceased reaching. He took the baby into his arms, holding the fragile warmth close to his chest. The heat soaked through his scarred palm. He bowed his head briefly, not in shame but in recognition. Then he placed the child back into Ahyoka's waiting arms. Without haste, they mounted again. Thomas kept one hand on the reins, the other resting lightly at Ahyoka's knee. He turned the horse. No man barred his path. Presence spoke where words would have faltered. At the far end of the street, an old man whose sharpened plow blades nodded once, solemn as an oath. The preacher's wife lowered her hand from her mouth to her chest. A boy lifted his cap, uncertain but earnest. These small gestures were enough. They left the town behind, the road opening into the wide plain once more. Sunlight struck across the grass, honest and unbroken. Ahead of them their shadows stretched long, three figures woven into one. The cottonwood welcomed them back with a groan of its branches. The wind moved through it like an old door swinging open. Thomas thought of the barn he would rebuild, the wood he would sand smooth until it held life again instead of loss. He thought of the kettle that would take flame, the shawl that would hang by the door, the rocking chair that would keep its steady rhythm. When they reached the yard, Thomas lifted Ahyoka down, steadying her as her hand lingered on his shoulder. He touched the baby's back lightly, his palm rough yet gentle. The door swung wide, and they stepped inside together. The three shadows on the road became one upon the floorboards. The kettle boiled. The rifle took its place on the pegs. The rocking chair creaked. Ahyoka untied her braid and bound it again with care. The child stretched, fists open to the warm air. The cabin absorbed their sounds and returned them as belonging. Thomas poured 2 cups of coffee, setting one before her, keeping one for himself. He touched his cup once to the table, a small knock, like a nail-driven square, sealing the vow that no one beneath his roof would be forsaken again.